under a gravel pit being dug for a small-town schoolyard, a secret older than the pyramids was waiting to blow apart the official story of the first Americans. Textbooks insisted no one would ever find an actual body to prove where those first Americans came from. A body had already been found, and it sat forgotten for 30 years, first in a stranger's private collection, then in a glass case under a bed. American Archaeology looked at it the year it surfaced and dismissed it as ruined, calling the dig an exercise in frustration. The 2-year-old girl living on that same ranch grew up to become the scientist who finally read its DNA. It happened in 1968 on a ranch outside Wilsall, Montana, and what she found would end one theory and expose something else entirely. Go back 46 years, May 1968. Wilsall, Montana, a ranching town of a few hundred people at the base of the Crazy Mountains. 2 local men, Ben Hargis and Calvin Sarver, are hauling gravel from beneath a sandstone overhang for a school drainage project. Nothing about the job suggests history. Then the shovels hit red, not rust, not clay. Ochre, a stained, rust-colored powder ancient people used to mark the dead as sacred. Underneath it, human bone, a child, maybe 18 months old, and around him, buried with a kind of care that survives 12,000 years, more than 100 stone and bone tools, every one of them coated in the same red dust. Nobody working that gravel pit knew what they had found. What they had found was this: the only Clovis burial site ever discovered on the planet. Not the only Clovis campsite, not the only Clovis tool cache. Clovis points, those distinctive fluted spearheads, had already turned up by the thousands across North America. What nobody had was a body to go with them. The only known grave. For decades, American schoolchildren were taught a clean, confident story about how humans reached this continent. Ice Age hunters crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska roughly 13,000 years ago, moved south as the glaciers opened a corridor, and became the Clovis people, named for the fluted stone spear points, first found near Clovis, New Mexico. Clovis first, the textbooks called it. The founding culture, the first Americans. It was a tidy answer. It also had a problem nobody could ignore. No one had ever found a Clovis person to test. Only their tools, their kill sites, their leftovers. The origin of an entire continent's population rested on stone, not flesh, not blood, not DNA. And for indigenous nations, this was never just academic. It intersected with sovereignty, land claims, the right to say we have been here since the beginning. Then, by accident, under a Montana ranch, someone found the body. You would think that discovery ends the mystery. It didn't. It started a different one that would take nearly half a century, a molecular biologist with a personal stake in the dirt and a Copenhagen laboratory to finally answer. Because before anyone could test this child's bones, the child himself had to survive one more threat: us. The 1968 dig was not run by archaeologists. It was run by 2 workmen with shovels, moving fast, clearing a path for gravel. By the time archaeologist Larry Laren arrived to look at the site about a week later, the layers of earth that would have told scientists exactly how the burial was arranged had already been disturbed. The University of Montana sent archaeologist D. Taylor to excavate what remained. His verdict, published the following year, became the title of his own paper, The Wilsall Excavations, an Exercise in Frustration. The finders hadn't left the tools where they lay. Soil from different layers had been mixed and backfilled before real archaeologists arrived. The most important skeleton in North American prehistory had walked into science already compromised. That single fact would matter more than anyone realized in 1968. A scrambled context does not just annoy archaeologists chasing precision for its own sake. It creates room for doubt, real and lasting doubt. And doubt on a discovery this important does not stay quiet for long. For years, the Anzac discovery sat in a strange kind of purgatory. It was famous enough that archaeologists knew its name. It was disputed enough that nobody wanted to build a career on top of it. The bones went, for reasons that remain only partly documented, into the hands of a private investigator for roughly 3 decades. Not a museum, not a university lab, a private individual holding the only known remains of a Clovis child, while the field of archaeology argued about land bridges and glaciers without him. The artifacts didn't fare much better than the bones. Pieces of the same assemblage drifted apart over the years, some ending up as far away as Washington, D.C., separated from the collection they belonged to by loans and simple neglect. The human remains themselves stayed with a private investigator until 1998, when they were finally returned to the Anzac family. Sarah Anzac would later say her parents kept some of the artifacts in a glass case under their bed for years. A burial 12,000 years old, disassembled into fragments, tucked into a bedroom in a ranching town nobody outside archaeology had heard of. It would take 30 years, a family reunited with what belonged to them, and a woman who had grown up 2 years old on that same ranch, to bring the boy back into the light. And what she would eventually do with his DNA would not just answer where the first Americans came from. It would put a stone tool theory, several careers, and a legal loophole most Americans have never heard of on trial at the same time. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand what was riding on one buried child. By the 2000s, Clovis First was already cracking, even without Anzac. Sites like Monte Verde in southern Chile had produced human traces older than Clovis, evidence people were already deep in South America, while the ice sheets up north were supposedly still blocking the way. The claim faced years of open hostility from the archaeological establishment before grudging acceptance in the late 1990s. That is what happens when a discovery threatens a story a whole discipline built its foundation on. But cracks in a timeline are one thing, a rival origin story is another, and by the time the Anzac bones were sitting quietly in private hands, a rival story had real academic weight behind it. It was called the Solutrean hypothesis, and it did not come from fringe internet theorists. It came from Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institution and Bruce Bradley of the University of Exeter, credentialed, published, taken seriously. Their argument? Clovis toolmaking looks suspiciously like a much older European stone tradition called Solutrean, practiced in Ice Age France and Iberia. Stanford and Bradley proposed Solutrean people had followed the edge of the Atlantic pack ice westward, hunting seals along the frozen margin, and reached North America long before anyone crossed from Siberia. Their book, Across Atlantic Ice, laid the case out in 2012. They pointed to real similarities in the stonework and to a genetic marker, mitochondrial haplogroup X2A, found in northeastern Native American populations, which they argued hinted at a Western Eurasian source. It was a theory built to unsettle people, and it worked. If true, it meant America's founding population hadn't walked in from Asia at all. It meant the first American story that indigenous nations and most archaeologists had accepted for generations was wrong at the root. Here's the uncomfortable part. For a decade, nobody could definitively rule it out. Not with tools alone. Stone doesn't carry ancestry. Stone can look similar for reasons that have nothing to do with who made it, technology invented twice, independently, by two people separated by an ocean and thousands of years. To settle it, you needed something Solutrean supporters didn't have, and Clovis First supporters didn't either. A body, blood, bone, a genome. And there was one, sitting in a box. Now bring in the woman who would eventually open that box. Sarah Anzac was roughly 2 years old in 1968, growing up on her family's 76-acre property along Flathead Creek, the same land where the Clovis child was found. She didn't choose this mystery. She was born into it. Decades later, she had a doctorate in molecular biology, a stint working on the Human Genome Project at the National Institutes of Health, and, improbably, custody of the very remains uncovered on her family's ranch when she was a toddler. She had the training, she had the technology developing around her, she had access, and for years, she didn't test them. She later described the whole project as a labor of love, pursued outside her day job, on her own time, personal, not professional, from the first phone call to the last shovel of dirt. Why hesitate with a discovery this significant sitting in her care? Because she'd watched what happened to Kennewick Man, another set of ancient North American remains found in Washington state in 1996 that triggered a bitter, decade-long legal battle between scientists who wanted to study the bones and tribal nations who wanted them reburied without further examination. Anzac had seen how quickly a scientific opportunity could turn into a public fight over identity, ownership, and respect for the dead. She held back, unable to find consensus with local tribes on how or whether to proceed. The remains stayed where they were, quiet, untested, waiting. There was also a legal wrinkle almost nobody outside archaeology knew about. In 1990, the United States passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, requiring federally funded institutions to consult tribes before studying or displaying Native American remains. It was written to prevent exactly the kind of unilateral, no-permission science that had defined so much of American archaeology's ugly history. But NAGPRA has a hole in it. It applies to federal land, federal funding, federal institutions. The Anzac site was private property. The bones were legally the Anzac families to do with as they chose. No agency had to be consulted. No tribe had a legal veto. The law that was supposed to prevent exactly this situation simply didn't reach it. That's not a conspiracy. It's a documented legal gap in federal law. But sit with what it means. The single most important skeleton in the debate over the first Americans could be tested entirely legally without a single indigenous nation's consent being required. The loophole wasn't hidden. It was written into the statute for anyone who cared to read it. Almost nobody outside the field ever did. It sat there for years anyway, untested, not because the law demanded caution, but because Sarah Anzac chose it. Then in 2009, an outside push finally moved things. Archaeologist Michael Waters at Texas A&M suggested sending the remains to a laboratory in Copenhagen, the lab of geneticist Eske Willerslev, who had already sequenced one of the first ancient human genomes on record, a 4,000-year-old individual from Greenland. Anzac agreed, on one condition: she would be personally involved in the work, not as a bystander, as a scientist, as family. She wasn't going to let someone else read her own history without her in the room. Willerslev's team, before publishing anything, did something unusual for the field's history. In 2013, he traveled to Montana reservations to explain the coming study before it went public. He didn't want tribes learning about it only when it was published, he later said. It was a good instinct. It was also, for many people he spoke with, about a decade and a half too late. The site had been dug in 1968. The consultation happened in 2013. Many tribal members would later say plainly, they wanted to be asked before the science started, not after. That tension, real evidence against real consent, would not go away. It would only get louder once the results came in. In the lab, the process was methodical, almost anticlimactic compared to the stakes riding on it. Sarah Anzac personally extracted DNA from skull fragments. The team sequenced the child's genome to an average depth of 14.4 times over, enough to be confident in the result, then compared it against genetic samples from populations across the globe. 143 groups outside sub-Saharan Africa, 52 Native American populations specifically. The first readout came back on the maternal line, mitochondrial haplogroup D4H3A, a lineage already known, already documented in living Native American populations. Then the paternal line, Y chromosome haplogroup QL54, again a marker tied to Indigenous American ancestry. Not European, not Solitrian, not anything that could be traced back across the Atlantic ice. Sarah Anzik would later describe the moment she saw the maternal result match. Her heart just stopped. The full genome told the same story, at scale. The child from the Montana ranch was more closely related to living Native American populations than to any other population on Earth, not similar to, more closely related to, than every other group tested, combined. His ancestors weren't from Iberia. They weren't from France. The genetic trail ran the other direction entirely. Back through Siberia, back across the ancient land bridge, exactly where Clovis First had always pointed, just with a body attached to the claim for the first time in history. The Solitrian hypothesis did not survive contact with this data. Genetically, there was no European component to explain. Willerslepp's paper, published in Nature in February 2014 with Sarah Anzik as a co-author, closed the door that Stanford and Bradley's stone tools had left open for a decade. That should have ended the debate. It didn't, not entirely. Stanford, Bradley, and a colleague published a rebuttal defending their position, arguing the X2A mitochondrial marker they'd relied on still deserved explanation. Most archaeologists and geneticists moved on, treating the Solitrian hypothesis as functionally dead, but functionally dead and gone are different things. The theory kept a public life outside the journals, and an uglier one. A 2018 documentary highlighted how the Europeans came first framing had been picked up by white nationalist groups, who used it to argue for a European claim to the continent that predated and undermined Indigenous ancestry and land claims. Stanford and Bradley never intended that use. Bradley has rejected the association outright. But once a theory escapes the lab, its authors don't get to control who picks it up. The genome had answered the big question. It had also, without meaning to, exposed how a piece of archaeology can be weaponized long after the people who study it have moved on. And the genome wasn't finished causing problems yet. Remember the original crack in the story, the disturbed 1968 dig, the mixed soil layers, the scrambled context. It had left behind a second, smaller anomaly nobody had fully resolved. Some of the antler and bone tools buried with the child had radiocarbon dated hundreds of years older than the child's own bones. If the tools predated the boy by centuries, was he really Clovis at all? Or was he a much later burial, dropped into an already ancient tool cache, an heirloom collection, not a contemporary one? It sounds like a technicality. It isn't. If the child wasn't genuinely contemporary with the tools around him, the whole first genetically confirmed Clovis person claim gets shakier. The tightest evidence in the debate over the first Americans would rest on a chronology nobody could quite square. It took until 2018 for a team led by Lorena Becerra Valdivia to reassess the site's chronology, publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Using refined dating methods, they found the child and the Clovis tools were, after all, from the same era, genuinely contemporaneous, not centuries apart. The mismatch that had haunted the site for 50 years came down to dating precision, not a hidden later burial. Larry Lauren had always pointed to one detail as proof the assemblage belonged together. Every single piece, tool and bone alike, carried the same red ochre stain. The reversal complicated the story rather than simplifying it. This wasn't a clean mystery solved moment. It was a case where a 50-year-old anomaly got explained, and in getting explained, made the original discovery's evidence even harder to dismiss. Then, in December 2024, a completely different kind of test added a final layer nobody in 1968 could have imagined. Researchers led by James Chatters ran stable isotope analysis on Anzik 1's bones, chemical signatures that, in a nursing infant, read back his mother's diet, not his own. The result? Roughly 40% of her diet had come from mammoth. The rest was elk, bison, and other large game. Small animals barely registered. Co-author Matt Wooler compared her isotopic signature to that of the scimitar cat, an extinct predator known specifically as a mammoth specialist. This wasn't a family eating whatever they could catch. This was a Clovis mother, and by extension a Clovis culture, built around hunting the largest animals on the Ice Age landscape, animals that would go extinct not long after. 12,600 years after his death, a Montana infant's bones were still answering questions nobody in 1968 thought to ask. By 2014, the science was as settled as it was ever going to get. What remained unsettled was everything else. Co-author Shane Doyle, a member of the Crow Nation, told Wilsall and Sarah Anzik something simple after the results came in. Put the child back where his family had left him. Doyle didn't see the boy as a data point. He saw a distant relative. Doyle and Wilsall then drove roughly 1,500 kilometers across Montana, meeting with tribal nations to arrange what the law had never required anyone to arrange in the first place. Real consultation after the fact about what should happen to a child whose DNA now linked him to their own ancestors. On June 28, 2014, Anzik 1, along with the unrelated younger remains found nearby, were reburied on a sagebrush hillside in the Shields River Valley, close as state law would allow to the original site near the Crazy Mountains. It rained through most of it. Roughly 30 tribal representatives attended, drawn from close to a dozen nations that had been consulted beforehand. Crow and Confederated Salish and Kootenai members playing leading roles in the ceremony. There was singing, burnt sweetgrass, drumming. Sarah Anzik held the remains herself before they went back into the ground, and red ochre, the same substance that had marked his burial 12,600 years earlier, was scattered over the soil one more time. Francis Auld of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes called the original excavation unfortunate, but said he could accept the science if it ultimately served native nations. Crow elder Thomas Larson, Medicine Horse Sr., told the Anzik family he hoped the day brought them the same closure it brought his own people. Wilsall, standing in the rain, said he hoped it marked the start of something better between science and indigenous communities, and admitted he expected criticism from other scientists for allowing an ancient genome, still capable of yielding more data with future technology, to go back into the earth. Shane Doyle put it most plainly of all. The discovery confirmed what tribes had never doubted in the first place, that they had been present on this land since time immemorial, and that the artifacts pulled from Montana soil belonged to their direct ancestors, not to a mystery. Sarah Anzik called it one of the most amazing days of her life. Peaceful, a moment of closure, unity, despite the rain, or maybe partly because of it. Here's what that ceremony didn't erase, though. The legal gap that let the entire study happen without required tribal consent stayed exactly where it was. Nothing about NAGPRA changed because one family chose, this time, to consult voluntarily. The next private landowner who unearths ancient remains on their own property is under no more legal obligation than Ben Hargis and Calvin Sarver were in 1968. The Anzik case became a widely cited model of respectful practice specifically because respectful practice wasn't required. That's not comfortable, it's not supposed to be. The precedent it set, though, mattered immediately elsewhere. Wilsall's team went on to sequence Kennewick Man, the very case Sarah Anzik had once feared repeating, publishing the results in Nature in 2015. That genome, too, showed closer ties to modern Native Americans than to any other population, directly undercutting decades-old claims that had used skull measurements to argue for European or Polynesian origins, claims that had been used to block repatriation in court for years. Kennewick Man was finally reburied by Columbia Plateau tribes in February 2017. Anzik 1 wasn't just a discovery anymore. It was a precedent, cited case by case, changing how ancient remains get handled across the country, and the genetic story itself kept moving, refusing to sit still, even after 2014's headlines faded. The original claim that Anzik 1 was a direct ancestor to roughly 80% of living Native Americans across 2 continents turned out to be more complicated than the first press coverage suggested. Follow-up genomic studies in 2018 found that many later South American populations don't actually carry a strong ANZIC-specific genetic signature, hinting at a population shift or partial replacement sometime after 9,000 years ago that nobody has fully explained. The founding population wasn't one simple wave that spread out and stayed put. It was messier, branching, splitting, in places replacing itself, in ways the 2014 study's headline number didn't fully capture. So, the DNA answered the question the world wanted answered. No Solitrean seafarers, no European origin story, ancestry running back through Asia and Beringia, exactly where indigenous oral tradition and mainstream archaeology had long pointed. But it opened a newer, harder question underneath that one about exactly how and when and in how many separate movements that ancestry actually spread across 2 continents. The map is not finished. It may never be finished. What is finished is the argument that started this whole search. The theory that tried to hand America's origin story to Ice Age Europe is, by the genetic evidence, dead, even if it still gets resurrected in places its own authors never intended and can no longer control. Go back to that Montana hillside. The rain has stopped by now, most years. The sagebrush grows over ground that has held this child twice, once for 12,600 years undisturbed, once more starting in 2014, this time with 30 nations standing over him instead of 2 men clearing gravel for a school. Somewhere in Helena, the tools that were buried alongside him, the ones still coated in ochre, the ones that survived being scattered as far as Washington, D.C. before being gathered back together, sit under museum glass at the Montana Historical Society, artifacts with no body attached to them anymore, because the body has gone home. The Clovis First story that once needed no evidence beyond stone points now has a genome behind it, and a genome willing to keep complicating the very story it confirmed. The Solitrean theory that once threatened to rewrite an entire continent's ancestry has no DNA to stand on, and still, somewhere, someone is using it to argue exactly that. NAGPRA still doesn't reach private land. The next ANZIC one could be found tomorrow on someone's ranch, with no legal requirement that anyone ask permission before reading what's inside the bones. 12,600 years ago, someone knelt beside a dying child in the Shields River Valley, covered him in red ochre, and packed the ground around him with the finest tools they owned, and walked away believing he was protected. He was, for 12,600 years. Then 2 men digging gravel for a school found him again, and the argument over what he means has not stopped since. The bones are back in the ground now. The question they answered is settled. The one they raised in its place is still open, sitting on a quiet hillside under the crazy mountains, waiting for whoever digs next.